Dozens of people are searching for a missing hiker in the gorge.
21-year-old Riley Zickel set out on an overnight hike by himself.
Colorado County Sheriff's Office is searching for a missing hiker on the Olympic Peninsula.
John and Trevor Higgins, the father and son, were last seen Friday. They disappeared while hunting near Bear Camp Road above Agnes.
21-year-old Riley Zickel, the senior at Lewis and Clark College, disappeared.
An emotional plea from friends of a woman who is missing right now in the Skamania County wilderness. She's 19 years old, Maureen Kelly.
Searchers are looking for a 76-year-old farmer who did not come back from mushroom hunting near Grangeville.
Hello, and welcome to the Pacific Northwest Missing Persons Project. As always, I'm your host, Tanner Hoskins, Executive Director here at PNWMPP, and this week's episode is a special Halloween edition that we have created from the strange, spooky, and true-life horror stories that have been shared with our team via email from individuals who wanted to tell their hair-raising stories of either becoming lost and how they self-rescued, or of strange things that they have witnessed and experienced while recreating in the great outdoors. This podcast episode is part 1 of 2. These stories are shared in a campfire story format, utilizing AI voiceover to narrate the story on behalf of the witnesses that have either asked to remain anonymous or did not leave a method for us to contact them for follow-up. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer. Most of these stories cannot be confirmed through our independent research tactics, and, as with any story, we encourage you to listen with open ears, an open mind, and with a little bit of skepticism. Skepticism is how curiosity grows and provides us with our own search for answers when something doesn't sound realistic or unfamiliar to us. With that being said, let's dive into this week's episode. Story number 1, The Phantom Light.
I've hunted these Montana woods for years, and I've always respected them, understood that nature has its own rules. But what happened to me in the fall of 1994, I'll never forget it. It was mid-October, just as the first real cold snap hit. I was deep in the wilderness, tracking deer. My pack was light, and I'd planned to be back at my truck by evening, maybe camp out if the hunt took longer. But around late afternoon, things started to go sideways. I must have lost track of the main trail, chasing after a fresh set of tracks. The forest had this eerie stillness about it, the kind that presses in on you, makes every noise seem louder than it is. The sun was setting fast, and soon I realized I was nowhere near where I thought I was. It's not like me to panic, but the sinking feeling hit me when the landscape around me felt unfamiliar. Every tree, every ridge, just didn't look right. I tried retracing my steps, but I might as well have been walking in circles. Shit, I probably was. As the sky darkened, I made the decision to stop and make camp. There was no use wandering in the dark. I gathered some wood and got a fire going. The warmth was a small comfort, but in the pit of my stomach, I knew I was in for a rough night. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a light moving through the trees. My first thought was pure relief. Another hunter. Maybe someone from the nearby ranch. It was small, about the size of a flashlight beam, bobbing slowly through the trees. I stood up, cupped my hands around my mouth, and called out, "Hey, over here!" The light stopped. For a moment, it just hovered there, like it had heard me. I waited for a response, expecting to see a figure step into view. But nothing. The light started moving again, this time drifting toward me. And that's when I noticed something wasn't right. There was no sound, no footsteps, no rustling of the underbrush, just this strange floating orb of light, maybe a couple feet off the ground. I felt a chill creep up my spine as it got closer. There was no body attached to it, no hunter, just the light floating through the trees like it had a mind of its own. My legs felt rooted to the spot as it bobbed and weaved almost playfully in my direction. Panic hit me hard. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. I snapped out of it and doused my fire with dirt and whatever water I had left in my canteen, desperate to snuff out the light, to keep myself hidden from this thing. As the fire hissed and went out, darkness swallowed the clearing along with a wave of white and gray smoke, blocking my view of the orb and, I hoped, the orb's view of me. I darted behind the tree nearest me. I chambered a round in my rifle and began walking slowly backwards, facing the direction of the orb. About 100 feet from where I had been sitting, I finally spotted the fucking thing again. The orb had stopped, as if it was waiting for me to reappear. I could feel it watching me, even though it had no eyes, no shape, nothing. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in shallow, shaky bursts. Every part of me screamed to run, but where? I had no idea where I was, and the last thing I wanted was to wander aimlessly into the forest with that thing following me. I stayed crouched there, my body tense, gripping my rifle, though I doubted it would do any good. The orb slowly drifted back into the woods, disappearing behind the trees. I sat there for hours, frozen in fear, listening to the woods around me, the silence only broken by the occasional crack of branches or a distant groan of something moving just out of sight. I was sure that whatever that orb was, it was still out there, circling, waiting. When daylight finally broke, I didn't waste any time. I packed up and moved fast. I didn't care which way I was going. I just needed to be anywhere but there. It took until about noon that day before I finally stumbled onto a dirt road and flagged down a passing truck. I didn't tell the driver about what I'd seen. I wasn't sure how to explain it, and frankly, I didn't want to relive it. All I knew was that those woods weren't the same after that night. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. And whatever it was, I didn't want to experience it again.
Story 2. The Bipeds of Pansy Lake.
I was camping alone near Pansy Lake in the Bull of the Woods wilderness of Oregon. It was late September, just after sunset, and the woods were peaceful, at least at first. I'd set up camp on the eastern side of the lake, and my small fire was casting a soft glow around the clearing. The sky was clear, and the temperature was dropping fast, so I was sitting close to the flames, listening to the occasional crackle of the fire and the gentle lapping of the water on the shore. Everything felt right. I'd spent plenty of nights in the wilderness, and the stillness usually brought a sense of calm. But that night, there was something different. It started with a noise, something moving on the opposite side of the lake. A rustling, like heavy footsteps pressing through the brush. At first, I figured it was just an elk or a larger deer. They'd wander through this area sometimes, so I wasn't too concerned. I could see the shine of the eyes, glowing from the reflection of my fire. They were low at first, like an animal grazing. I moved towards the shoreline to get a better look, then I realized the eyes were not just reflecting off my campfire glow, they were almost, or maybe they were, glowing. A green glow, unlike any eye shine I'd ever seen. I believe the eyes stared at me as the wind shifted, blowing my scent in its direction, then it stood up. It was big, taller than I expected, and it was moving with a strange, deliberate pace. I had never seen a bear stand up and walk. My brain desperately wanted it to be a bear, so I began squinting into the dark across the lake. The fire wasn't bright enough to fully illuminate what I was seeing, but those eyes, they were large, and they stared back at me. It didn't feel like an elk or a deer, or a bear anymore. The longer I watched, the more unnerved I became. My gut was telling me something was off. A shriek echoed across the water, loud and high-pitched, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't an animal call I recognized, no elk, no bear, maybe a mountain lion, though I've never heard a lion firsthand. It was nothing from this forest. It was almost like a scream of a woman running for her life. It froze me in place. While I was fixated on the eyes I had seen from my fire, I didn't realize that there were two figures, huge, standing upright, easily over 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like thick fur or hair. My brain thought grizzly, but there are no known grizzlies in Oregon anymore. They moved slowly along the shore, then periodically standing watching me as if baffled by my presence. Even at that distance, I could see their massive frames, broad shoulders, and long arms hanging at their sides. I couldn't breathe. These weren't animals. They were something else. The creatures lingered for a moment, then they started to move, slowly at first, almost like they were scared of whatever I was. Albeit I was standing my ground, because fear had made me motionless. The fire flickered, and as they edged farther into the darkness, the realization hit me hard. I was alone out here with these things, and there was no one around for miles. I scrambled back to my tent, grabbing my hatchet as I ducked inside. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That's all I could hear. I zipped the tent shut and sat there, waiting, listening, sure the tent would be ripped open at any moment. Outside, the fire crackled softly, and for a long time, there was nothing but silence. I didn't dare move. I could barely even breathe. Every little noise made me jump, imagining those things creeping closer, circling the camp, watching. The hours dragged on, the fear sinking deeper and deeper until I thought I'd go mad from it. But they never came closer. At least, I don't think they did. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I didn't waste a second. I packed up in a rush, leaving in such a haste I forgot to pack my tent and everything that I had inside of it. Not once did I look back at the lake. I just hurried out of there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that those eyes were still following me from the shadows. I haven't been back to Pansy Lake since. And I doubt I ever will.
Story number 3. The Pack of Lake Pend Oreille.
I've spent more time outdoors than most people ever will. Born and raised in northern Idaho, I've hunted, fished, and camped in just about every corner of these woods. But what happened near Lake Pend Oreille last summer, I still can't explain it. It was supposed to be a simple day trip. Some fishing, a little peace and quiet. The lake is remote, perfect for a getaway from the world. I parked my truck near a trailhead and hiked in early that morning, pack slung over my shoulder and my rod in hand. It was cool, the air crisp, the scent of pine thick in the breeze. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. It started mid-morning, just as I'd settled into a good rhythm at the water's edge. I noticed movement in the brush across the water from me, about 50 yards out. At first, I didn't think much of it. Wildlife is common out here. As the movement neared, I could finally make out what it was, a coyote, one at first, low to the ground, creeping closer, their eyes fixed on me. As I watched that coyote, 3 more appeared behind it. They weren't doing what coyotes normally do when they spot a human. They weren't skittish, weren't moving off in the opposite direction. No, they were watching me. I stood up, yelled, waved my arms, even threw a few rocks, but they didn't budge. Not like they should have. Instead, they just lingered there in the brush, eventually sitting down scratching themselves as if they were my dog at home. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Something wasn't right. I tried to ignore them, went back to fishing, thinking maybe they'd lose interest and move on. But the whole day they stayed close. They were always there, always watching. Occasionally they'd whine, bark, or let out these strange, almost playful yips, like they were mocking me. By about 1 p.m. in the afternoon, I decided enough was enough. I packed up and started back toward my truck. That's when things got worse. The moment I hit the trail, I don't know how they crossed the waterway, but they did, and the entire pack followed. At least the 4 of them, maybe more. Their yips, barks echoed through the trees, sharp and unnatural, as if they were summoning something. They were bolder little fuckers. Panic started to creep in. I'd hunted coyotes all my life, but I'd never seen a pack behave like this. They weren't afraid, they were hunting me. My heart was racing as I tried to quicken my pace, but every time I glanced back, they were there, keeping up with me. Not quite pursuing, but following like I had a piece of steak strapped to my back. I was angry, frustrated, and unsure what they had planned for me, and fired a shot from my .357 Magnum into the air. The sound echoed through the trees, and for a moment, they scattered. But not far. They retreated, but just out of my sight. They were smart, too smart for coyotes. They became silent, and I kept moving, pushing myself harder than I had in years. By the time I reached the truck, my nerves were shot, and I could still hear them pushing through the brush behind me. I threw my gear into the cab, jumped in, and slammed the door. I got my keys in the ignition, fired up my truck, and checked my mirrors. What a fucking sight. One coyote, alone in the tree line, staring straight at me. Its eyes staring, I swear to God, into my rearview mirror at me, And it didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, watching. Its head was cocked slightly, like it was waiting for something. It wasn't afraid, wasn't retreating. It just stared. I flipped it off over my shoulder as I peeled out of there, gravel kicking up behind me. But as I looked into the rearview mirror, that coyote was still there, standing in the same spot, eyes fixed on me, watching as I drove away. I don't know what I saw that day, but I've thought about it ever since. The way they moved, the way they watched me, it wasn't normal. I've hunted enough to know when something's not right, and those coyotes, or whatever they were, weren't behaving like any animals I've ever encountered. Looking back, I can't shake the feeling that they weren't coyotes at all. Maybe they were something else, skinwalkers, shapeshifters, or something even worse. It hasn't scared me from fishing, but I do my best not to go alone anymore.
That's it for the Halloween edition, Part 1. For Part 2, look for the immediate next upload following this one. These stories are something that, like I said, we cannot confirm, but holy crap, why would anybody make this up? Truly hair-raising tales about the wilderness and the animals that call the area home.